sanctuary cities. We talk about it like it's no big deal. Sanctuary cities. What's a sanctuary city? What's a sanctuary state? They're illegal, unconstitutional cities and states. The Democrat Party is in charge of sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. What does this mean? Well, let's get into this. This is very important because it has to do with your lifestyle. It has to do with what kind of country you want to be. They talk about a constitutional crisis. Every constitutional crisis we have in this country has been caused by the far left and the Democrat Party and their courts and their elected officials. Every single one. You and I, we are constitutional originalists. We hold up the Constitution. We say, what does it say? What does that mean? What did the framers mean? What's the context of this language? They don't do any of that. They wave it around while they're attacking it. And the people who wrote it. This means nothing to them. Because how can you be a radical leftist, a Marxist, or an Islamist, and give a damn about the Constitution? You don't. And they don't. It's just so much noise for them when they say it. So we have Article 1, Section 8. Congress has exclusive authority to what? Quote, establish a uniform rule of naturalization, unquote. Our Constitution is written in such a way where the federal government is given certain powers and all the rest of the powers are left to the states. It's called federalism. It's the 10th Amendment. But the powers that are given to the federal government, unless they're explicitly said to be shared, are plenary. In other words, they're supposed to be few, but they're powerful. So the Constitution says the federal government's in charge of immigration. Period. Not AOC, not New York City, not San Francisco. The federal government, the national government. Well, Mark, what about Texas and Governor Abbott? What were they doing when Biden was president of the United States? They were actually upholding and enforcing federal immigration law, whereas Joe Biden was violating it and should have been impeached for it. Not only violated a little part of the immigration laws, he violated the whole construct of our immigration laws with wide open borders. And the result? The greatest level of slavery since the end of the Civil War. Women sold into sex slavery, children sold into sex slavery, and on and on and on, and we've talked about it before. Is that humane? No, it's not humane. Are sanctuary cities and states humane? No, they're not humane. Look at what's taking place in these cities and states. But, humane or not, that's not even the point. The Constitution's the point. These people yell constitutional crisis whenever they don't get to advance their radical left-wing agenda. So Article 1, Section 8 makes it abundantly clear that even a left-wing Harvard Law professor can understand that Congress has this power. But what about the president? The president's been delegated authority, and a lot of authority under our immigration laws, under a federal law, which I'll get to in a moment. So this isn't a federalism issue, it's not a 10th Amendment issue. Donald Trump is president, the federal government makes immigration policy and is supposed to enforce the immigration laws. Period. Period. So what's with these states and sanctuary cities and states? It's called nullification. I want you to remember that word. Nullification. What's nullification? When local and state governments declare they will defy federal law or the federal constitution, in this case, federal immigration law, that they won't enforce it, that they will obstruct it, they will obstruct compliance with it, they will sabotage efforts by the federal government to enforce it and federal policies and set themselves apart from the federal government, apart and above from the federal government. They will decide in the city what immigration policy is. They will decide in a blue state what immigration policy is. That's nullification of federal law, which is utterly and completely destructive of our Constitution. Nullification is not only unconstitutional, it was used by the slave states, starting with South Carolina, in the lead up to the Civil War, to justify secession from the Union. See, the Democrat Party hasn't changed all that much. The characters have changed, the groups have changed, but the ideology has never changed. The Democrat Party is a destructive party that has never embraced the Constitution, not from its earliest days. It's not only the party of slavery, it's not only the party of segregation, It's not only the party of eugenics. It's not only the party of Jim Crow. It's now the party of nullification all over again, 160 years later. In other words, the slave states declared they could, would, and did nullify federal law, even the Constitution, and the Confederacy was born. Their argument was, look, we states within our state will decide what part of the Constitution applies or if the federal government's applying it properly. Now, you can challenge these things and so forth and so on, but you can't declare them nullified. Nullified. For one, we have the Supremacy Clause. For two, we have the entire construct of the Constitution. Powers are divided. We also have 8 U.S.C. Section 1182 that gave to the president broad authority to prevent aliens from entering the United States. It's a law. We also have 8 U.S.C. Section 1373 that prohibits local and state governments from banning the sharing of information about aliens and their legal status and whether they're criminals and so forth and so on. Federal law. So they're not only nullifying the construct of the Constitution, the Supremacy Clause, they're also nullifying federal law. We actually have federal district courts that are good with this, just as they're good with trying to control the executive branch, where you have about a dozen of these knucklehead federal judges, these lawyers in black robes, many of whom are nothing more than bad lawyers in black robes, who are trying to sabotage and usurp President Trump's perfectly legitimate agenda in managing the executive branch, because after all, he's in the Constitution. We have what's called a president. He was elected by all the people, an election of all the people, and he's allowed to manage the executive branch. So the Biden regime actually supported the acts of these sanctuary states and cities, sabotaging the Constitution and federal law from within, because that's the Democrat Party. So what's to stop local and state governments from nullifying all kinds of constitutional federal laws? What if a state says, you know what, we're going to nullify what the Democrats did here, we're going to nullify this, we're not going to recognize that? Well, why isn't that legitimate if it's legitimate for sanctuary cities? A little bit of history for you folks out there. The nullification crisis of 1832 and 33, just a very short explanation. South Carolina, again, declared federal tariffs because they're a cotton-growing state. Tariffs were very high. It was the only way for the feds to raise money. There was no federal income tax. So they put these very heavy tariffs, John Quincy Adams did first, and they were upheld by Andrew Jackson later, to make South Carolina said, we're not going to abide by these tariffs. You're killing our economy. We've decided within the state of South Carolina that your law is to be nullified. We're not telling other states what to do. We've just made that decision. President Andrew Jackson said this would lead to the breakup of the Union. We can't have states going in 50 different directions where we have a federal law that is legitimate and constitutional, and some state decides they don't want to. Imagine if other states did that. So they eventually reached a compromise, but Jackson was prepared to send the Army into South Carolina. They actually passed a statute in Congress called the Force Act, but they had a compromise, and they eventually reduced the amount of the tariffs on cotton and agriculture over a period of time. But that was the predecessor to what would become nullification of the anti-slavery movements in the North. That was the predecessor to states nullifying their obligation to be part of the Union. It was the pretext to secession, nullification. Their type of sanctuary states. Came back in the 1950s. Opposition to desegregation after Brown versus Board of Education. That was a Supreme Court decision where the Supreme Court corrected its Plessy versus Ferguson decision, where separate was equal. Brown versus Board of Education said, no, separate but equal isn't equal. We were wrong about that. So the court ruled in favor of desegregation, or if you prefer, integration of the races. The Supreme Court ruled in Cooper versus Aaron in 1958 that states could not nullify federal laws involving desegregation and integration. That is Brown versus Board of Education. So they ruled again. It came to a head in Arkansas. Governor Orville Faubus, who was a segregationist, he called up the National Guard to block 9 black students from entering Little Rock Central High School. You may have heard of that. President Eisenhower, he said, wait a minute. You don't get to nullify, number 1, what happened after the Civil War. Number 2, the Constitution. Number 3, a Supreme Court decision. So he sent active duty military down to Little Rock, nationalized the National Guard, and they walked those 9 black students into that high school and protected them. That's what Eisenhower did with the old Democrat Party. So this issue of state sovereignty and federal authority, it's not always clear. There are debates, there's litigation, and that's okay. But what is clear is that the issue of nullification of sanctuary cities and sanctuary states is utterly and completely unconstitutional. It's settled by the construct of the Constitution, the Supremacy Clause, the Civil War, Supreme Court decisions, whether lower courts want to adhere to it or not. Every single city and state, I want you to look at the list of the states and the cities and the towns that have self-declared nullification from the federal Constitution, just like the Confederacy, that they are going to prevent, they are going to obstruct, they're going to slow walk, do whatever they can to undermine the ability to enforce our federal immigration laws, under which the Constitution gives plenary power to the federal government, in which the president is responsible for overseeing and executing the entire sanctuary movement. In its attempt to nullify the Constitution and federal law is a throwback to the Confederacy. It is a throwback to the days of slavery and segregation, to today, to the days of slavery due to Democrat Party open border policies that took place and the horrendous, inhumane consequences. So my point is this: the old Democrat Party, the party of the Confederacy, has never died. Sure, its issues have changed, the groups have changed, but the ideology has not. See, the Democrat Party has never embraced Americanism. It's never embraced the Constitution. They don't embrace Americanism and the Constitution. Well, they keep lecturing us about Americanism and the Constitution. Don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do. We're here with former Speaker